I watched through the sheer curtains as the obsidian black Porsche Taycan glided into my gravel driveway. It was a silent, predatory machine, the kind of car that hummed with the arrogance of a man who spent money he hadn't earned. I sat at my kitchen table in the same spot I'd occupied for 34 years, my hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. I didn't get up. I didn't have to. The front door didn't just open. It swung wide with a flourish that signaled an invasion. Vance Sterling stepped into my foyer, adjusting the cuffs of a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. He didn't knock. He never did. He treated my home like a subsidiary of his failing empire, a place he only visited when the accounts ran dry and the wolves started scratching at his designer door. "Elias," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, the tone of a man who'd spent his life selling vapor to people who breathed air. "Good to see you're still keeping the old fortress standing." I didn't look up from my newspaper. I'd spent 3 decades as a battalion chief for the Charlotte Fire Department. I'd seen backdrafts, structural collapses, and men facing their final moments. I could read a person's internal temperature before they even opened their mouth. Right now, Vance was running hot, desperate, though he tried to hide it behind a veneer of old money sophistication that he'd borrowed from the very people he was trying to impress. "The house is fine, Vance," I said, finally folding the paper. "What do you want? I have a shift at the station in 2 hours." He pulled out the chair across from me, the wood scraping against the linoleum in a way that set my teeth on edge. He leaned in, elbows on the table, projecting that partnership energy he'd learned in some weekend seminar. "I've got a window, Elias. A real one. There's a development project in Noda high-rise residential with a commercial ground floor. My lead partner just had a capital call, and I'm a few units short of the majority stake. I'm looking at a 20% return within 18 months. I took a slow sip of my cold coffee. "And let me guess, you're exactly 15,000 short." Vance's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. 20, actually. "But for you, I'll structure it as a preferred equity position. You'll be the first one paid out." I looked him dead in the eyes. "Vance, let's talk about first paid out. Let's talk about the consulting firm in Haingen Le Haimliba, 5,000. Let's talk about the biotech startup last winter, 8,000. And the digital asset platform that vanished 3 months ago, another 10. You owe me $23,000 in investments that never matured. In my world, we call those losses. In your world, apparently, they're just appetizers." The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Vance stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped. He began pacing the small kitchen, his expensive shoes clicking like a countdown. "You're an old-school guy, Elias. I get it. You think wealth is built by sitting on a fire truck for 30 years and collecting a pension. But the world has changed. Real money requires leverage. It requires vision. Sten ten raisin. It requires honesty," I countered, my voice low and steady. "And I've yet to see any of that from you." He stopped at the window, looking out at my modest yard. "You know, Clara is worried about you. She thinks you're becoming isolated, bitter. She's worried that your outdated views are going to affect the boys. Sam and Leo miss their grandfather, but I have to wonder if it's healthy for them to be around this kind of negativity." The threat was subtle, wrapped in the guise of paternal concern, but I heard it as clearly as a siren in the night. He was using my daughter and my grandsons as a bargaining chip. Again. "Vance," I said, rising slowly to my feet. I may be retired from the front lines, but I still carried the bulk of a man who had hauled 100-pound hoses up 6 flights of stairs. "Don't ever use those boys to get to my wallet. You're walking on thin ice." "It's not a threat, Elias. It's a reality check," he snapped, his voice losing its polish. "We're busy people. Our schedule is tight. If you can't be a team player, if you can't support the family's future, then maybe we just don't have the room for these weekend visits. Think about it. Is $20,000 really worth losing the only family you have left?" He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out, the front door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the house. I sat back down, the silence suddenly heavy. I looked at the silver-framed photo on the mantel. Clara, my beautiful daughter, looking tired but smiling, with Sam and Leo squeezed between her. And then there was Vance, standing slightly behind them, looking like he was already planning his next exit strategy. I'd paid off their mortgage 3 years ago, $180,000. Clara had come to me in tears, saying they were weeks away from foreclosure because of a bad turn in the market. I'd emptied my deferred comp, my rainy day fund, Everything I'd bled for, just to make sure those boys had a roof over their heads. I thought I was being a hero. I didn't realize I was just building a gilded cage for my own family. By Saturday, the silence was deafening. I'd called Clara 6 times. She hadn't picked up once. I'd sent texts to the boys' iPads, nothing. I knew Vance was behind it. He was a master of the silent treatment as a power move. He wanted me to crawl. He wanted me to show up at his door with a check and an apology for being difficult. Instead, I went to my safe. I pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Mutngin Bonchumlea High Eagle Crest Drive. I spent 3 hours reading through every line of the paperwork I'd signed 3 years ago with a lawyer named Marcus Thorne. No relation. Just a man as meticulous as I was. Back then, Marcus had warned me. Elias, I know it's your daughter, but money changes the shape of a room. Let's record this properly. I'd listened. Thank God, I'd listened. Sunday morning, I drove to their neighborhood. Eagle Crest was the kind of place where the grass was vacuumed and the silence was expensive. I pulled my aging Ford F-Mot Chumnamuy into the driveway, the engine's rumble sounding like a protest against the manicured perfection of the cul-de-sac. I walked up to the towering mahogany doors and knocked. Not a polite rap, but the heavy thud of a man who was owed an explanation. Vance opened the door. He was wearing a silk robe, a glass of green juice in his hand. He looked at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. Changed your mind, Elias? I told you, the window for the NODA project is closing, but for you, I might be able to squeeze. I'm here to see the boys, I interrupted. Like I said on Thursday, we're tied up. Soccer practice, a brunch with the Hendersons. It's a full day. Maybe if you'd been more cooperative earlier in the week, we could have carved out an hour. Vance, move aside. No. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression turning cold. Here's the new math, Elias. I'm tired of the lectures. I'm tired of you acting like you own us because you helped out once. From now on, if you want a weekend with Sam and Leo, it's going to cost you. Think of it as a maintenance fee. $2,000 per visit. It covers our time, the boys' expenses, and the stress your presence causes this household. I felt the heat rising in my chest. That old fire that usually meant a building was about to go. You're charging me to see my own grandsons? I'm valuing my time, he corrected. Take it or leave it. Do you have the money? I reached into the inner pocket of my leather jacket. I pulled out a long, white envelope. I didn't say a word. I just handed it to him. Vance's eyes lit up with a sickening triumph. See? I knew you'd come around. You just needed a little perspective. He took the envelope, his fingers almost trembling with greed. He didn't even wait for me to leave. He tore it open right there in the doorway, expecting to see a stack of hundreds or a certified check. Instead, he pulled out 3 pages of legal bond paper, stamped with a crimson seal from the county clerk's office. I watched his face. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a confused frown, then a ghostly pallor. His hand began to shake as he read the bold heading at the top of the first page. What is this? He stammered, his voice jumping an octave. That's a notice of default and an intent to foreclose, I said, my voice as cold as a mountain stream. You see, Vance, I didn't help you out 3 years ago. I bought the private mortgage from your bank and recorded a subordinate lien against the title. According to the contract you and Clara signed, the loans you've been taking from me since then were legally categorized as advances against equity. You've missed every single repayment deadline. You can't do this, he roared, his face turning a violent shade of purple. This is our home. You gave this to Clara. I gave Clara a future, I said, stepping closer until I could smell the expensive juice on his breath. You turned it into a piggy bank. According to those papers, you have 30 days to vacate or pay the full balance of the lien, $312,000, including interest and legal fees. I'll sue you. I'll strip you of everything. He was screaming now, his voice echoing through the marble foyer. Behind him, I saw Clara appear at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of horror. Sam and Leo were peeking through the banisters, their eyes wide with fear. You won't do anything, Vance, I said, turning to walk back to my truck. Because I'm not just taking the house, I'm taking back the boys. I didn't want it to come to this, but you set the price for family. I'm just here to collect. I got into my truck and started the engine. As I backed out, I saw Vance standing on the porch, the white papers fluttering in the wind like a flag of surrender he was too stupid to wave. He was screaming something, but I couldn't hear him over the roar of my engine. I drove away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd won the first round, but as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw Clara standing in the doorway, clutching her sons to her sides. I'd started the fire to save them, but I didn't know yet if I was going to be the one to get them out alive. I sat in my darkened kitchen for 3 hours after I got home, watching the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the linoleum like skeletal fingers. The silence in my house used to be a sanctuary, a hard-earned reward after 30 years of sirens, screaming engines, and the rhythmic thud of an axe against a burning door. But that night, the quiet felt like a heavy blanket soaked in gasoline. I had just set a match to my daughter's life. I told myself I was doing it to save her, to pull her out of a structure that was already collapsing, but the doubt was a slow-burning ember in my gut. I kept seeing Clara's face at the top of those stairs, the look of a woman who had just realized the floor beneath her was nothing but ash. I didn't know it then, but the foreclosure notice was only the first alarm. The real fire was buried much deeper, in the parts of their marriage Vance had kept hidden even from Clara. I should have seen the smoke years ago. It started at their wedding at the Duke Mansion. It was a high society affair that I couldn't afford, yet Vance had insisted on paying for everything. He'd stood there in a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, leaning over to me with a glass of vintage scotch in his hand. "Don't worry about the tab, Elias," he'd whispered with a wink that didn't reach his eyes. "In the Sterling family, we don't count pennies. We count legacy." I remember looking at my hands calloused, scarred, and stained with the soot of 1,000 emergencies, and feeling like an intruder in my own daughter's life. Vance didn't just marry Clara, he colonized her. He convinced her that her father's world was quaint and limited, and that only he could provide the horizon she deserved. The first year was a blur of European vacations and gallery openings. Vance was a consultant, a term I eventually learned was code for man who moves other people's money until some of it sticks to his fingers. He was charming, he was connected, and he was a master of the grand gesture. But I noticed the small things, the way he'd snap at waiters when they didn't recognize him, the way Clara started checking her phone every 3 minutes, her shoulders tensing whenever a notification chimed. I saw the light in her eyes begin to dim, replaced by a constant, low-level flicker of anxiety. She was living in a palace, but she was walking on eggshells. By the time Sam was born, the cracks were visible to anyone who knew how to look for structural failure. Vance had moved them into the Eagle Crest house, a sprawling Mediterranean-style monstrosity that looked more like a museum than a home. It was meant to be his statement, but it was built on a foundation of lies. I found out later that he'd leveraged everything he owned to get the down payment. When the first market correction hit, he didn't tighten his belt. He didn't find an honest job. He came to me. He played the part of the grieving provider, telling me that the bank was predatory and that he just needed a bridge to get through a temporary cash flow crunch. I gave him $60,000 that day. I thought I was protecting my grandson's nursery. What I was actually doing was fueling Vance's gambling habit with the high-stakes table of life. But the most dangerous thing about Vance Sterling wasn't his greed. It was his ability to make you feel like the villain for having boundaries. Monday morning, my phone finally rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the caller. It was Clara. Her voice was thin, brittle, like dry parchment ready to tear. "Dad, how could you?" Vance told me everything. He told me you've been planning this for years, that you're trying to take the boys away from us because you never liked him. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the kitchen window. "Clara, that's not what happened. He tried to charge me $2,000 to see my own grandsons. He's been using you as a shield for his debts for years. I had to stop the bleeding. He said that was a joke, Dad. A joke to show you how much he values our privacy." She was sobbing now, the raw, ugly sound of a woman whose world was spinning out of control. "He said you took a private joke and used it to try and put us on the street. Do you know what it's like in this house right now? He's packing his things in the guest room. He says he can't stay in a home owned by a man who hates him. He says I have to choose, my father or my husband." The choice. It was the ultimate weapon in the narcissist's arsenal. He was isolating her, forcing her into a corner where her only hope for survival was to cling to him. "He's gaslighting you, Clara. He's been skipping the taxes. He's been taking loans from me that he never intended to pay back. I have the ledger. I have the bank records." "I don't care about the records," she screamed. "I care about my sons. They saw the sheriff at the door, Dad. They think Grandpa is coming to take their toys away. How am I supposed to explain this to them? The line went dead before I could answer. I stood in the middle of my living room, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I had spent my career saving people from fires they didn't start. This was the first time I was the one who had turned up the heat. I felt a surge of rage so pure it made my hands shake. Vance wasn't just a failure. He was a parasite. He was using the boy's fear to cement his control over Clara. He was turning my own daughter into his defense attorney. I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for the 30-day clock to run out. Vance wasn't the type to go quietly. He was the type to burn the house down with everyone inside rather than let someone else hold the deed. I grabbed my keys and drove down to the station. I needed to see my old friend, Silas Miller. Silas was a captain now, but more importantly, his brother was a forensic accountant who worked with the DA's office. If I was going to fight Vance, I needed more than just a foreclosure notice. I needed to find out where the rest of the money had gone, because $20,000 here and there didn't explain the level of desperation I'd seen in Vance's eyes. A man doesn't extort his father-in-law over a joke. He does it because he's drowning. Alias, Silas said, looking up from a clipboard as I walked into the bay. The smell of diesel and floor wax always acted like a sedative for my nerves, but today, even the station felt tense. I heard about the move you made. The word gets around the department fast. Foreclosing on your own kid, that's a heavy axe to swing, Chief. It's not my kid I'm cutting out, Silas. It's the rot attached to her. I pulled him aside, away from the younger guys washing the trucks. I need your brother. I need him to look into Vance Sterling's corporate filings. Something isn't adding up. He's living like a king, but he's begging like a pauper. Silas leaned back against the massive tire of engine we're high, his face darkening. I'll give him a call. But Elias, be careful. My brother sees guys like Sterling all the time. When the money runs out, the ego stays. That's a dangerous combination. They don't just lose, they destroy. I've spent 30 years around things that destroy, Silas. I'm not scared of a guy who wears silk socks. Maybe you should be, Silas muttered. Fire doesn't have an ego. Fire doesn't care if you're a battalion chief or a rookie. But a man like Vance, he'll find your weak spot, and he'll pour the accelerant right there. I left the station and headed back toward the suburbs, but I didn't go home. I drove toward Noda, the neighborhood Vance had mentioned. He'd talked about a high-rise development. Sure thing. I found the address he'd boasted about. It was a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. There was a sign posted on the gate. Property seized, federal tax lien. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a capital call. Vance wasn't looking for a $20,000 investment. He was looking for a getaway fund. He'd lied about the project, which meant he was likely lying about everything else. I pulled out my phone to call Clara, to tell her what I'd seen, but then I saw a black SUV pull up to the lot. A man got out, not Vance, but someone I didn't recognize. He was wearing a dark windbreaker and a baseball cap pulled low. He walked to the fence, looked around, and then pulled out a heavy-duty bolt cutter. I watched from across the street as he snipped the lock and disappeared into the shadows of the abandoned construction trailer on the far side of the lot. This didn't look like business. This looked like a crime scene in the making. I sat there, my hand hovering over the steering wheel, wondering if I should call the cops. But then my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My breath hitched as I opened it. It was a photo. It was a picture of my own house, taken from the street. My front door was slightly ajar. Underneath the photo was a single sentence. You shouldn't have opened the safe, Elias. Some fires can't be contained. The cold realization hit me like a physical blow. Vance knew I was looking. He wasn't just hiding from the bank. He was hiding something much bigger, something he had kept in the house he thought I'd never reclaim. I slammed the truck into gear and raced back toward my neighborhood, my mind screaming. I'd focused so much on the mortgage that I'd forgotten the most basic rule of firefighting. Never turn your back on a room you haven't vented. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel flying. My front door was wide open, swinging gently in the afternoon breeze. I ran inside, my hand reaching for the heavy mag light I kept in the side pocket of my door. Clara? Sam? I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. There was no answer. I ran to the bedroom, to the closet where the safe was. The heavy steel door was hanging off its hinges, the locking bolts sheared clean through. The floor was littered with papers, my birth certificate, my pension records, my service medals, but the folder labeled Sterling Personal was gone. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic ticking coming from the basement. I froze. I knew that sound. It wasn't a clock. It was the sound of an electronic igniter, the kind we used to see in arson cases, where the perpetrator wanted a head start before the whole block went up. I sprinted toward the basement door, my adrenaline override kicking in. I didn't think about the risk. I thought about the files, the evidence, and the fact that Vance was trying to erase his trail by burning down my history. I kicked the door open and flew down the stairs, the smell of kerosene already thick in the air. In the center of the room, sitting on my old workbench, was a small, black box with a digital countdown. Hung, bon nuit lam. Hung, bon nuit bon. But it wasn't just a bomb. Strapped to the side of the device was a small, digital recorder. It was playing a loop of audio that made my blood turn to ice. It was the sound of Sam and Leo giggling, their voices high and happy. "Grandpa, look at the big fish. Grandpa, are you coming over?" It was a recording from the fishing trip last year. The ticking continued. Hum. Bamui. I reached for the device, my hands steady despite the roar in my ears. I had 30 seconds to decide if I was going to save my house or find out where Vance had taken my daughter and grandsons, because as I looked closer at the workbench, I saw a single, handwritten note pinned under the device. "They're waiting for you at the Noda lot, Elias, but only if you can get through the smoke." I realized then that the man I'd seen at the vacant lot hadn't been a stranger. He was the distraction. The real trap was right here, in my basement, and the clock wasn't just for me, it was for them. The white chemical dust from the fire extinguisher hung in the air like a ghost as I stood over the blackened husk of the device. My lungs burned, not from smoke, but from the raw adrenaline that was still surging through my veins. The ticking had stopped. The digital recorder, now a melted piece of plastic, had been silenced, cutting off the haunting echoes of my grandson's laughter. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. I didn't wait for the fire department to arrive, though I could already hear the distant, familiar wail of sirens approaching my brothers from the station, responding to the silent alarm I'd tripped when I entered the house. I took the stairs 2 at a time, grabbed my service pistol from the locked drawer in the hallway, and sprinted back to the truck. My mind was a chaotic map of Charlotte, flashing red over the no-dad district. Vance was a parasite, a man who fed on the stability of others. But I hadn't realized until this moment just how far he was willing to go to protect his illusions. He wasn't just hiding a failing business. He was burning down the world to keep from being seen for what he truly was. As I sped toward North Davidson Street, the streetlights began to flicker on, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the pavement. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I found myself drifting back to a memory I hadn't touched in years, the day Clara brought Vance home for the first time. It was a humid Sunday in July, the kind of day where the air feels like a damp wool blanket. She had been so proud, glowing in a way I'd never seen before. "He's a sterling, Dad," she'd said, as if the name itself were a title of nobility. Vance had stepped out of a car that cost more than my house, wearing a smile that was a little too perfect, shaking my hand with a grip that was a little too practiced. I remember the way he looked around my modest living room, the sagging bookshelf, the framed photos of my late wife, Sarah, the worn recliner. He'd looked at it all with a patronizing pity that he disguised as respect. "It's so grounded, Elias," he'd said. "A man of the people. I admire that." Even then, something in my gut had signaled a 4-alarm warning. Vance didn't admire me. He was measuring me. He was checking to see if I was a threat or a resource. And like a fool, because I wanted Clara to be happy, I chose to be a resource. I thought about the thousands of dollars I'd handed over since that day. It wasn't just the mortgage. It was the private school tuition for Sam and Leo that Vance said he'd cover but forgot during a banking transition. It was the country club fees, the necessary business travel, the endless stream of capital calls for projects that never seemed to break ground. I'd watched my retirement account, the money Sarah and I had saved for our own sunset, drain away like water into sand. Every time I questioned him, he'd turn it back on me. "Do you want them to live in a world of limitations, Elias? Or do you want them to have the sterling legacy?" Legacy. It was his favorite word. But as I pulled into the gravel entrance of the Noda lot, I saw what that legacy really looked like. The black SUV was parked near the rusted construction trailer, its headlights off. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting timber. I cut my engine and rolled to a stop, the silence of the lot feeling like a physical weight. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. My hand hovered near my waist, but I didn't draw the weapon yet. I was a fireman. I was trained to assess the structure before I broke down the door. "Vance!" I shouted, my voice booming in the empty space. "I'm here. Let them go." The door to the construction trailer creaked open. A man stepped out, but it wasn't Vance. It was the man in the dark windbreaker I'd seen earlier. Up close, he looked like a man who had spent too much time in the sun and not enough time on the right side of the law. He had a jagged scar that ran from the corner of his eye to his jawline, and his eyes were flat, devoid of any warmth. "You Elias?" the man asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Where are they?" I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the shadows behind him. "Vance didn't mention you were a big guy," the man said, ignoring my question. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it, the orange ember glowing in the twilight. "He said you were a simple civil servant. He said you'd come here with a checkbook, ready to make things right. The only thing I'm making right is your dental work if you don't tell me where my daughter is." The man laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Relax, Chief. Nobody's hurting the girl, or the runts. They're safe. For now." He leaned against the trailer, blowing a plume of smoke into the air. "But, Vance, he's got a problem. A big one. It turns out that legacy he talks about. It's mostly other people's money, my employer's money specifically. And my employer is a very impatient man." "I don't care about Vance's debts," I snapped. "You should. Because Vance told us you were the bank. He told us you had a safe full of cash and property deeds. He said you were the one holding out on him. That's why we went to your house today. To see if the Sterling Bank was open for business." The realization hit me like a backdraft. Vance hadn't just been stealing from me. He had been using me as collateral for his debts to people far more dangerous than any bank. He had convinced these men that I was the one keeping the money from them. The bomb in my basement hadn't been a trap for me. It was a message from these men to Vance, and Vance had turned it around to lure me here. "Where is Vance?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Probably halfway to the coast by now," the man said, flicking his cigarette into the dirt. "He used the distraction at your house to get his own car out of the city. But he forgot one thing. We don't like being played, and we don't let our collateral walk away." He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. 2 more men stepped out from behind the SUV. One of them was holding a phone. He tapped the screen and held it up for me to see. My heart stopped. It was a live video feed. It showed the interior of a car, a silver Mercedes I recognized as Clara's. She was driving, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her face streaked with tears. In the back seat, Sam and Leo were huddled together, looking out the window with confusion. "They think they're going on a surprise vacation," the man in the windbreaker said. "Vance told her you were on your way to meet them at a beach house in Wilmington. But the car she's driving? It's got a GPS tracker and a remote kill switch. We control that car now, Elias. We stop it whenever we want. And we can start it. Or worse." "What do you want?" I asked, my mind racing through every rescue scenario I'd ever practiced. But this wasn't a fire. There were no hoses to pull, no ventilation holes to cut. "We want the deeds," the man said. "The ones you were so proud of in that white envelope. Vance told us you have the original title to the Eagle Crest House and 3 other properties in the city. We want them signed over. To a holding company we represent. Do that, and your daughter keeps driving. Don't, and the Mercedes has a very unfortunate mechanical failure on the I-bone mui." The pressure in my chest was unbearable. I had spent my life protecting people, and now I was being asked to trade the only thing I had left for the lives of my children. But I knew how these men operated. If I gave them the deeds, they wouldn't just let Clara go. They would have no more reason to keep her alive. I was the only leverage left in this game. "I don't have the deeds on me," I lied, my voice steady despite the terror. "They're in a safety deposit box. The bank opens at 8 tomorrow morning." The man in the windbreaker squinted at me, trying to see if I was bluffing. "You're a brave man, Elias, but you're a bad liar. Vance said you never trust banks. He said, you keep the real papers in a hidden compartment in that safe we opened, the one we couldn't find." I felt a spark of hope. They hadn't found the hidden compartment. The real documents, the ones that proved Vance had been forged my signature on the earlier investments, were still there. But if I told them that, I'd be inviting them back to my home. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, keeping my eyes on the men. It was a message from Silas Miller. "Fire Marshal is at your place. He found the device. It's a signature piece, Elias. Arson for hire out of Gaston County. The guy's name is Garrett Gator Vance. No relation to your son-in-law, but he's been on our radar for months. We're tracking his cell signal now." I looked up at the man in the windbreaker. "Gator?" I asked. The man froze. His eyes narrowed, and the casual lean disappeared. "How do you know that name?" "Because I'm not a simple civil servant," I said, finally drawing my pistol and leveling it at his chest. "I'm the man who knows everyone who tries to burn this city down. And right now, every cop in Charlotte is converging on your signal." The man reached for his own weapon, but he was slow. I didn't fire. I didn't have to. From the entrance of the lot, 4 unmarked police cruisers roared into the gravel, their blue and red lights exploding into the darkness. The men scrambled, but they were trapped. Silas had come through. But as the police swarmed the lot, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. From Clara. I answered it, my heart in my throat. "Clara? Are you okay?" "Dad!" Her voice was a scream of pure terror. "Dad, the car won't stop." "Vance, he's not here. He jumped out at a stoplight. He told me to keep driving. The brakes aren't working, Dad. I'm on the highway and I can't slow down." I looked at the man in the windbreaker, who was now being tackled to the ground by 2 officers. "The kill switch," I roared. "How do I stop the car?" He spat on the ground, a bloody grin on his face. "You shouldn't have called the cops, Chief. The kill switch isn't a brake, it's an accelerator. Vance told us if things went south, to make sure the evidence didn't survive the crash." I watched the phone screen. The speed on the digital display of the Mercedes was climbing. "Bay muy lum. Da muy lum." Clara was screaming. The boys were crying in the back, and I was 200 miles away, watching my world move toward a brick wall at 90 miles an hour. The scream that ripped through the phone wasn't just Clara's. It was the sound of a mother realizing her children were strapped into a silver-plated coffin. I stood in that dusty no-day lot, surrounded by the swirling blue lights of Charlotte's finest, but I was miles away, hurtling down Interstate Bon Muy with them. My hand was shaking so violently I had to grip the phone with both paws, pressing it against my ear until it bruised. "Clara, listen to me," I barked, my voice cracking through the terror. "You are a thorn. You don't freeze. You don't quit. Look at me. Look at the road. Tell me what the speedometer says." "It's at 95, Dad. The engine is screaming. I'm pushing the brake pedal and it's soft. There's nothing there." Her voice was a jagged edge of panic. In the background, I heard Sam's high-pitched sobbing and Leo's eerie, rhythmic whimpering. They were terrified, and their terror was fueling hers. "Focus, Clara. Shift the car into neutral. Push the stick forward, right now." I tried. It won't move. The screen is red, Dad. It says system override. It's like the car is driving itself. I felt a cold, oily sweat break out across my neck. Vance hadn't just used a kill switch. He'd used a full system hack. This was Heingenlehe, Heimweisal, and these luxury German machines were basically rolling computers. If you knew the right backdoors, and with Vance's tech investments, he certainly did, you could turn a luxury sedan into a guided missile. I looked down at Gator, who was pinned to the gravel by a rookie cop. The man was grinning. Even with a knee in his back, he was enjoying the show. "Tell me how to break the override," I screamed at him, stepping over the police line. "How do we stop the car?" Gator spat a glob of bloody phlegm onto my boot. "Vance paid for the premium package, Chief. There's no stop button, not until it hits something solid. He said he wanted to be a widower with a very large insurance payout. Said it was the only way to clear his legacy and start over in the Caymans." The world tilted. Vance wasn't just running, he was purging. He was liquidating his family to pay off his sins. I didn't have time to beat the answer out of Gator. I turned back to the phone. "Clara, you have to use the emergency brake, but slowly. Do not yank it. It's the button near the console. Pull it and hold it, but only for a second at a time. We need to friction brake." "I'm trying, Dad, but there's a truck. Oh God, there's a tanker truck ahead." The sound of tires screeching and Clara's desperate gasp filled the line. I closed my eyes, picturing the stretch of Ibon Muy she was on. It was a death trap of construction zones and high-speed commuters. My mind raced through 30 years of extraction training. I'd pulled families out of crushed minivans and doused flames on burning buses, but I had never felt this helpless. I was the man who always had the axe, always had the hose. Now, I only had my voice. "I'm calling the State Patrol," I said, signaling to Silas Miller, who was already on his radio. They're going to clear the road ahead of you. You keep that wheel straight, Clara. Do you hear me? You are the captain of that ship. Don't you dare let go of that wheel. I'm scared, Dad. Sam is crying for you. He wants to know if you're coming. I'm coming, honey. I'm right behind you. I lied. I was 2 hours away, but I'd tear the asphalt up with my bare hands if I had to. As Silas coordinated with the highway patrol, I jumped back into my truck. I didn't care about the crime scene. I didn't care about the evidence. I roared out of the Noda lot, my tires screaming. I needed to get to the I Bon Muy corridor. I needed to be there when the car finally stopped, one way or another. But as I drove, the deeper betrayal began to settle into my marrow. This wasn't just a moment of madness from Vance. As I looked at the call logs on my dash, I saw a string of messages I hadn't noticed before, hidden notifications from an encrypted app I'd accidentally mirrored to my tablet months ago when I helped Vance set up his home office. I pulled over for 10 seconds, scrolling through the decrypted cache. The messages were between Vance and a woman named Elena Van Dorn, a name that sounded like old money and new silk. The old man is the last hurdle, Elena, one message read. Once the lien is settled via the accident clause, the Eagle Crest property and the fire captain's pension assets will flow to Clara's estate. And since I'm the executor, we'll be in Zurich by the end of the month. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. Vance hadn't just been stealing my money. He had been grooming Clara to be a sacrificial lamb. He had deliberately weakened her credit, isolated her from her friends, and made her dependent on him so that when the accident happened, there would be no one left to question the paperwork. He had turned her into a walking insurance policy. I didn't know it yet, but Vance hadn't jumped out at a stoplight like he'd told Clara. He was closer than she thought. Dad? Clara's voice came back, lower now, strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes right before the end. The speed is at 105. The steering is getting heavy, I think. I think the power steering is failing too. Stay with it, Clara. The State Patrol is 5 miles ahead of you. They're going to use a pit maneuver or a rolling block. No? She whispered. There's a bridge, Dad. The Cape Fear River Bridge. There's construction. It's down to 1 lane. If I hit the barricades at this speed, you won't hit them. You're going to thread the needle. I love you, Dad. Tell the boys. Tell them I tried. Don't you talk like that. Clara. Suddenly, the audio on the line changed. The wind noise intensified, and I heard a metallic thud. Then, a new voice entered the fray. A voice that made my heart stop. She's doing great, Elias. Really. A natural behind the wheel. It's a shame about the German engineering, isn't it? It was Vance. He wasn't on the side of the road. He was in the car's system. He had patched himself into the Bluetooth override. He was listening to us. He was watching her die in real time, probably from a tablet in a safe house somewhere nearby. Vance, you son of a bitch, I growled, my voice vibrating with a primal rage. I will find you. I don't care if I have to walk through hell. I will find you and I will end you. You'll be too busy planning 3 funerals, Elias, Vance said, his voice silky and devoid of any humanity. And the beauty of it is, the notice of default you served me, it'll look like the motive for your breakdown, the disgruntled father-in-law who pushed his family to the edge. The narrative is already written. I'm the grieving husband. You're the bitter old man who lost his mind. I'm coming for you, Vance. I'm already in the fire. Then burn, Elias, burn. The line went silent. Then, a deafening crash echoed through the speakers, followed by the sound of twisting metal and shattering glass. Then, the most terrifying sound of all, absolute silence. I screamed her name until my throat bled, but there was no response. I slammed my fist into the dashboard, the plastic cracking under the force. I was a mile from the bridge. I could see the smoke rising into the moonlight, a thick, black column of oily fire. I pushed the truck until the engine groaned, weaving through the stopped traffic on the bridge approach. When I reached the crest, the scene was a nightmare. The silver Mercedes had slammed through the water-filled orange barriers and was teetering on the edge of the bridge deck, its front end crumpled like a soda can. The engine compartment was a roar of orange flame, the magnesium engine block spitting white-hot sparks. I didn't wait for the truck to stop. I jumped out before it even cleared the lane, grabbing my heavy-duty fire axe from the bed. I ran toward the wreckage, the heat scorching my face. Clara, Sam, I yelled, the roar of the fire swallowing my voice. The car was hanging by a single reinforced cable from the construction crane. One wrong move, one shift in the wind, and it would plunge 60 feet into the black water of the Cape Fear River. I reached the driver's side door. It was jammed shut, the frame twisted. Through the spider-webbed glass, I saw Clara. She was slumped over the airbag, blood trailing down her forehead. In the back, the boys were strapped in, silent and motionless. The fire was spreading to the cabin. The smell of burning upholstery and melting plastic was suffocating. I swung the axe with everything I had, the blade biting into the tempered glass. Crack, crack, shatter. I reached inside, unbuckling Clara's belt. She was a dead weight. I pulled her out, her body limp in my arms, and dragged her 10 feet back toward the pavement, just as the front tires exploded. "Stay here," I whispered to her unconscious form. I turned back for the boys. The car groaned, the metal screeching as it shifted another 6 inches toward the abyss. The flames were licking at the rear doors now. I didn't have time for the axe. I grabbed the door handle and pulled, the heat searing my palms. It wouldn't budge. I looked through the window. Sam's eyes opened. He looked at me, his small face pale and streaked with soot. He didn't scream. He just pressed his hand against the glass, right where mine was. "Grandpa," he mouthed. The car shifted again. The cable snapped, with a sound like a gunshot. The Mercedes began to slide. I had 3 seconds. I could reach for Sam, or I could try to anchor the car. But as I lunged for the door, I saw a black SUV idling on the opposite side of the bridge, watching. The driver's window rolled down just an inch. A pair of expensive sunglasses caught the glare of the fire. Vance was there. He had come to watch the finale. The car tilted. The rear wheels left the pavement. I dived through the broken window, grabbing Sam's jacket. I felt the sickening lurch of gravity taking hold. I wasn't just pulling them out. I was falling with them. I felt the world drop away. That sickening, weightless lurch that usually precedes a scream. But in that moment, the only sound was the groan of stressed metal and the roar of the river 30 feet below. I was half in, half out of the rear window of the Mercedes, my boots scrabbling for purchase on the crumbling asphalt of the bridge deck, while my hands gripped Sam's jacket with a strength that felt like it was cracking my own bones. The car tilted, its rear bumper scraping the concrete, sparks showering into the abyss. I'd spent 30 years waiting for the floor to give way, but I never thought I'd be the one holding it up. "Leo, unbuckle him, Sam, right now," I roared. My voice was shredded by the heat, sounding more like a grunt than a command. Sam was paralyzed. His eyes were dinner plates, reflecting the orange hell growing in the front seat. The fire had breached the dashboard. The fumes of burning synthetic leather and melting wire were a toxic fog. I knew what happened next, the flashover. In a few seconds, the interior temperature would hit 1200 degrees and everything would ignite simultaneously. "Sam, look at me." I reached in and grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. "Be a fireman. Do your job. Get your brother out of that seat." That word fireman, it snapped something into place. Sam reached for Leo's harness. His small fingers fumbled with the plastic clip, which had begun to warp from the heat. I lunged further into the car, the glass shards from the broken window biting into my chest and arms. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the heat of the fire licking at the back of my neck and the precarious tilt of the car. I grabbed my pocket knife, a serrated Spyderco I'd carried since my rookie year, and reached past Sam. I sliced through Leo's harness in one clean stroke. "Out, now." I grabbed Leo by his shirt and hauled him through the window, tossing him toward the solid ground where Clara lay. I didn't wait to see him land. I reached back for Sam, but as I gripped his hand, the car gave a final, mournful shriek. The construction cable that had been acting as a tether finally snapped. The Mercedes slid back. I felt my feet leave the bridge. For a fraction of a second I was airborne, looking straight into Sam's terrified eyes. I wrapped my arms around him, tucking his head into my chest, and kicked off the frame of the car with everything I had left. We tumbled onto the very edge of the bridge deck just as the silver sedan vanished into the dark. A second later, a dull thud echoed from the water below, followed by a hiss of steam that sounded like a dying breath. I lay on the asphalt, gasping for air that wasn't filled with soot. Sam was shaking in my arms, his face buried in my soot-stained jacket. I looked over and saw Leo crawling toward us, sobbing. Behind them, Clara was starting to stir, her eyes fluttering open as the blue and red lights of the first responding patrol cars finally reached the crest of the bridge. I looked across the median, toward the opposite lane. The black SUV was still there, idling. I saw the flash of the driver's cell phone. He was taking a picture. Vance wasn't just watching, he was documenting his tragedy. He thought he'd just witnessed the end of his problems. He didn't know I'd cleared the car. From his angle, behind the smoke and the flames, it must have looked like we all went over. The SUV suddenly accelerated, its tires chirping as it roared away toward the Wilmington exit. Elias, talk to me. Silas Miller was the first one to reach us. He skidded to a halt in his department SUV, jumping out with a medical bag. I saw the fall, I thought. Jesus, Elias. Get the boys, I wheezed, pushing Sam toward him. Get Clara. They need oxygen, now. We've got ambulances coming up the wrong way on the shoulder, Silas said, his hands moving with professional speed as he checked Leo for injuries. State Patrol is setting up a perimeter. We're going to get you out of here, Chief. No, I said, forcing myself to sit up. My hands were burned, the skin bubbling and raw, and my ribs felt like they'd been hit by a wrecking ball. He's going to Wilmington. The SUV, black Suburban, tinted windows. Vance was in it, Silas. He was watching. Silas paused, his face hardening into a mask of pure fury. He's already on the wire. I've got every unit from here to the coast looking for that vehicle. But Elias, look at Clara. I turned. Clara was sitting up now, being tended to by a state trooper. She was staring at the gap in the bridge where her car had been. She looked at her sons, then at me, and finally, she looked at the scorched asphalt where the orange barriers had been pulverized. The realization was beginning to dawn on her, not just that she'd almost died, but the way it had happened. The voice on the Bluetooth, the override. Dad, she whispered, her voice a ghost. He didn't stop it. He could have stopped it, and he didn't. He didn't just let it happen, Clara, I said, crawling over to her and taking her hand. He made it happen. He's been planning this since the day I served those papers. Maybe longer. She leaned her head against my shoulder and wept, not the frantic sobbing of earlier, but a deep, hollow sound of a woman who had just seen the monster under her bed and realized she'd been sleeping next to it for a decade. An hour later, I was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a wet trauma dressing wrapped around my hands. The boys were wrapped in blankets in the back of the rig, watching a cartoon on a paramedic's phone, their shock finally giving way to exhaustion. Clara was being treated for a concussion, but she refused to be transported without me. A state patrol sergeant named Garrett, a man with a square jaw and eyes that had seen too many highway fatalities, approached me with a tablet in his hand. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice low and respectful. I'm Sergeant Garrett. We've recovered the black Suburban. It was abandoned at a rest stop 3 miles down. The driver is gone, but we found something in the center console. He turned the tablet toward me. It was a digital copy of a police report filed 2 hours ago in Mecklenburg County. My heart sank. Vance Sterling filed an emergency restraining order and an endangerment report against you, Mr. Thorne, Garrett said. He claimed that you had a psychotic break following the foreclosure notice. He alleged that you threatened to drive his family off a bridge to spite him. He even provided a recorded phone call of you saying you were coming for him and walking through hell. He baited me, I said, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. He called me on the override. He was taunting Clara while she was trapped in the car. I believe you, Garrett said, especially after seeing the state of that car. But legally, you're in a tight spot. He's already reached out to the media. Local fire hero snaps after financial dispute. That's the headline he's pushing. And since he's the one who filed first, I have to take a statement, Elias, a formal one. And I have to tell you that there's a warrant being processed for your arrest for interference with a motor vehicle and endangerment of minors. I looked at Silas, who was standing nearby. He looked like he wanted to punch a hole through the ambulance. He's flipping the script, I muttered. He's using the legal system as his second accelerant. There's more, Garrett said, his voice dropping even lower. We did a preliminary check on the Sterling accounts. They're empty. Every dime of your daughter's inheritance, the boys' college funds, and the equity from the Eagle Crest house, it was wired to an offshore entity in the Grenadines 4 hours ago. He didn't just try to kill them, Elias. He robbed them blind before he did it. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Vance hadn't just been a bad businessman. He was a predator who had meticulously dismantled my daughter's life piece by piece. He had stolen her past, almost took her future, and now he was trying to steal her father's freedom so there would be no one left to chase him. What about the deeds? I asked. The ones Gator wanted? We found them on the guy in the windbreaker, Silas said. But they're worthless now. Vance forged Clara's signature on a power of attorney months ago. Technically, he had the right to transfer those properties. He's been playing a long game, Elias, long and dirty. I stood up, the pain in my ribs flaring, but I pushed through it. I looked at Clara, who was watching us with a hollow, haunted expression. I looked at my grandsons, who were safe only because I'd spent my life learning how to break things, to save things. He thinks he's won because he's got the money and the head start, I said. My voice regained its command. But he forgot one thing. I'm a fireman. I don't just put out the flames. I investigate the cause. I find the point of origin. I walked over to Clara. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. I need you to stay with Silas. Go to the safe house we talked about. Don't tell anyone where you are. Not even the lawyers. Where are you going, Dad? She asked, her voice trembling. The police. They have a warrant. Let them have it, I said. By the time they catch up to me, I'm going to have something they want more than a retired fire captain. I turned to Silas. I need the keys to your personal car, the old Bronco. Silas didn't ask questions. He reached into his pocket and tossed me the keys. Don't do anything I can't testify to, Elias. I'm not going to do anything, I said, headed for the parking lot. I'm just going to finish the investigation. I didn't know it yet, but Vance hadn't gone to the coast. He had gone back to the one place he thought I'd never look, the place where it all started. And he was waiting for the one person he thought could still help him finish the job. As I drove away from the bridge, the smoke still rising in the rearview mirror, I realized that the notice of default wasn't the end of the story. It was just the opening act. Vance Sterling had spent years pretending to be a man of legacy. Now, I was going to show him what a real legacy looked like, the kind that was forged in fire and didn't burn. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 10 years. A man named Miller, not Silas, but his brother, the one who worked for the DA. Miller, the voice answered. It's Thorne. I need a favor. I need you to pull the Van Dorn files. Specifically, the ones related to life insurance fraud in the Chinmuas. I think I found our guy's real father. The line was silent for a beat. Elias, that's a cold case. That family disappeared. They didn't disappear, I said, looking at a photo of Vance I'd pulled from Clara's Facebook page. They just changed their names and started looking for a new bank. I felt the piece of the puzzle click into place. Vance wasn't just a parasite, he was a second-generation arsonist. And he was about to find out that you can't outrun the man who knows exactly how you light the match. The rain began to fall as I crossed the county line. A cold, relentless drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the roadside diners and gas stations. I was driving Silas's Mutngin Chinchum Chinmui Bon Bronco, a vehicle that smelled of old upholstery and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the sterile, leather-scented tombs Vance preferred. My hands, wrapped in thick white gauze, gripped the steering wheel with a dull, throbbing H. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain up my arms, a constant reminder that I had traded my skin for my grandsons' lives. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of the radio. I'd turned it on just in time to hear the Mui Mot, Hung, PM News Bulletin. Tragedy on the Cape Fear River Bridge tonight. The anchor's voice crackled through the speakers. What began as a reported kidnapping ended in a horrific crash. Authorities are currently searching for Elias Thorne, a retired Charlotte Fire Battalion chief, in connection with the attempted murder of his own daughter and grandchildren. Thorne is considered armed and dangerous. His son-in-law, local businessman Vance Sterling, is pleading for his family's safety tonight from an undisclosed location. I hit the power button so hard the plastic knob snapped. I let out a jagged breath, the sound echoing in the cramped cabin. Armed and dangerous. Attempted murder. Vance hadn't just flipped the script. He'd rewritten the entire history of the Thorne family in a single evening. He was using my 30 years of service, the very thing I was most proud of, as the foundation for my supposed insanity. In the eyes of the world, I wasn't the man who saved them from the fire. I was the man who lit it. I pulled into the back of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Gastonia, parking under a flickering street lamp that was struggling to stay alive. I needed to meet Julian Miller. Silas's brother was a man who lived in the shadows of spreadsheets and tax returns, a forensic accountant who saw the world in black and white while I saw it in shades of orange and gray. Julian was waiting for me in a corner booth, a laptop open and a stack of folders piled high. He looked like Silas, but with a softer edge, the kind of man who fought his battles with a keyboard instead of a Halligan bar. When he saw me soot-stained, bandaged, and looking like I'd crawled out of a structural collapse, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to genuine horror. "Elias," he whispered, gesturing for me to sit. "I saw the news. The police are everywhere. You shouldn't be here." "I don't have anywhere else to go, Julian," I said, sliding into the booth. My ribs groaned as I moved. "Tell me you found something. Tell me Vance Sterling isn't the ghost he pretends to be." Julian pulled a folder from the bottom of the stack. He didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes scanning the pages as if double-checking the reality of what he was about to say. "Vance Sterling doesn't exist, Elias. Not before hanging Lam. He appeared out of nowhere with a clean credit history, a Stanford degree that turns out to be a very expensive forgery, and enough seed money to buy his way into the North Carolina social scene." I leaned forward, the smell of Julian's black coffee cutting through the lingering scent of smoke on my jacket. "Then who is he?" Julian turned the laptop screen toward me. It was a scanned image of a newspaper clipping from Ngin Chin Chum Chin Wei Tham, tragedy in the Hudson Valley. The headline read. Below it was a photo of a teenage boy standing in front of a burning warehouse. He looked hauntingly familiar, the same sharp jawline, the same predatory stillness in his eyes. "His name is Victor Van Dorn, Jr., Julian said. His father, Victor Sr., was a legend in the insurance world. He specialized in high-value asset recovery, which was basically a fancy term for burning down failing businesses and splitting the payout with the owners. He was an arsonist for hire with a corporate tuxedo. I felt the blood drain from my face. The Van Dorn fire. I remember reading about that in training. The father died in the warehouse. The son was the only witness. Except he wasn't just a witness, Elias, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Look at the secondary report from the fire marshal. They found the point of origin. It wasn't an electrical short like the father planned. Someone had poured accelerant outside the only exit. Someone made sure Victor Sr. didn't walk out of that building. The insurance payout was $12 million. It vanished 3 days after the funeral, and so did the boy. I looked at the screen, the pixels blurring before my eyes. Vance hadn't just learned the trade from his father. He'd perfected it by murdering him. He was a second-generation predator who had been refined by the fires of his own making. He hadn't chosen Clara by accident. He'd chosen her because she was the daughter of a decorated fire captain. He wanted the Thorn name, the ultimate symbol of integrity, to act as the perfect camouflage for his next cycle of destruction. He didn't just want my money, Julian, I realized, my voice sounding hollow. He wanted my reputation to be the one that snapped. If he kills his family and blames the insane fire chief, he doesn't just get the insurance and the assets. He gets a clean slate. He buries Victor Van Dorn, Jr., forever under the ashes of Elias Thorn. He's almost done, Elias, Julian said, tapping a key on his laptop. I tracked the wire transfers. He's liquidating the last of the Thorn properties tonight. The Eagle Crest House, your cabin in the mountains, even the deed to your childhood home in Noda. He's using that forged power of attorney to sell them to a shell company in the Grenadines for pennies on the dollar. Once that money clears, he's gone. And he's not going alone. What do you mean? He's booked 4 tickets on a private charter out of Charlotte Douglas at Beaune, Home AM. 1 for himself, and 3 for family members. My heart stopped. He wasn't done with them. He hadn't killed them on the bridge because I'd interfered, but he still needed them. Or at least, he needed the appearance of them. If he could get Clara and the boys out of the country, he could finish the job where no North Carolina state trooper would ever find the bodies. He was going to try and snatch them from the safe house. He knows where Silas took them, I said, standing up so abruptly, I knocked over my water. He's been tracking Silas's department phone. Elias, wait. Julian reached for my arm. You can't go there. The police have the safe house surrounded, but they're looking for you. If you show up, they'll open fire. You're the armed and dangerous suspect, remember? I looked at my bandaged hands. I was a man with no home, no badge, and a warrant for my arrest. I was at rock bottom, buried under the weight of a narrative I hadn't written. But as I looked at the photo of the young Victor Van Dorn, I felt a cold, familiar clarity settle over me. I'd spent 30 years understanding how fire moved, how it breathed, how it hungered, and most importantly, how it could be manipulated. Vance thought he was the master of the flame, but he was just a boy playing with matches. I was the man who knew how to starve the fire of its oxygen. He's not going to the safe house, I said, my mind racing. He's too smart for that. He's going to draw them out. He's going to use the one thing he knows will make Clara run to him. What? Julian asked. Me. I left the diner and walked out into the rain. I didn't get back into the Bronco. Instead, I walked to the edge of the parking lot, where a row of payphones stood, relics of a past that still understood the value of an untrackable connection. I dialed Silas's personal number, the one I knew Vance wouldn't be monitoring yet. "Silas," I said when he picked up, "don't talk. Just listen. Vance is Victor Van Dorn Jr. He's going to call Clara in 10 minutes. He's going to tell her that I've been caught, and that I'm being held at the old station on 9th Street. He's going to tell her that I'm hurt, and that I'm asking for her. He'll tell her the police are letting her in through the back entrance to avoid the media." "Elias, how do you know?" "Because it's the only way he can get her alone without fighting the guards. He knows she'll do anything for me." "Silas, you have to let her go. But you have to let her go with my help." "You're crazy, Elias. I can't let her walk into a trap." "It's not a trap if I'm already inside the structure, Silas. I'm going to the 9th Street station. It's decommissioned, empty, and I still have the master key. I'm going to set the stage. Tell the state patrol to stay back 5 blocks. If they move too early, he'll kill them all." I hung up before he could argue. The old 9th Street station was a brick-and-mortar ghost, a place where I'd spent the best years of my life. It was a fortress of memories, and tonight it was going to be the site of Vance Sterling's final audit. I drove the Bronco toward the city center, weaving through the back streets to avoid the checkpoints. My ribs screamed with every turn, and the gauze on my hands was soaked with rain and blood. I felt like a man who had already died and was just waiting for his body to realize it. I reached the station at midnight. It sat like a hulking beast in the shadows, its bay doors shuttered and its windows dark. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and cold concrete. I walked into the main bay, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew this building by touch. I went to the storage locker in the back and pulled out a crate I'd left there years ago, my retirement gear, my old turnouts, my helmet, and a heavy-duty thermal imaging camera. But I also pulled out something else. A 3-gallon jug of industrial-grade foaming agent and a flare gun. Vance thought he was coming here to stage a final accident. He thought he was going to walk into a dark room and end the Thorn legacy once and for all. He didn't know that I had already vented the roof. He didn't know that I had mapped the flow paths. I heard a car pull up outside the low, menacing hum of a high-end engine. I climbed the stairs to the mezzanine, my breath hitching in my chest. I looked down into the bay. The side door creaked open, and a sliver of moonlight spilled across the floor. Vance stepped inside. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was wearing a tactical jacket, a silenced pistol in his hand. He looked around the darkness with a confident, easy grace. "Elias," he called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "I know you're in here. Clara is on her way, you know. She's so predictable. Tell me, does it hurt? Knowing that the daughter you tried so hard to protect is the one who's going to lead me right to your head?" I stayed in the shadows, my hand gripping the flare gun. My heart was a steady thrum in my ears. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the element. "You're not Victor Van Dorn," I whispered, the sound carrying through the acoustic chamber of the bay. "You're just the smoke he left behind." Vance froze. He raised the pistol, scanning the mezzanine. "You've been doing your homework, Elias. I'm impressed. But the thing about smoke is, it's the part that actually kills you." "Not tonight, Victor," I said. I pulled the trigger on the flare gun. The bay exploded into a brilliant, blinding white light. But I didn't aim for him. I aimed for the ceiling, hitting the old fire suppression pipes I'd rigged with the foaming agent. A wall of thick, white chemical foam began to pour from the rafters, creating a blinding, suffocating curtain between Vance and the exit. It wasn't a fire, it was a whiteout. In the sudden chaos, I saw his eyes widen. For the first time in his life, the master of the flame couldn't see the exit. And that was when I started the countdown. 30 minutes until the police arrive, Victor, I said, my voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. Let's see if you can find the door before the oxygen runs out. The revenge plan hadn't just begun. The audit was officially in session. The chemical foam hissed as it carpeted the concrete floor, a thick, white sea of suds that swallowed the light and muffled every sound. In the center of the bay, Vance was a ghost in a blizzard. He spun around, the barrel of his silenced pistol sweeping through the fog, but the foam was too dense, the whiteout too complete. He couldn't see his own feet, let alone the man who had built this trap. You think this changes anything, Elias? Vance's voice was tight. the practiced charm replaced by a jagged, animalistic fear. He fired a shot into the darkness, a dull thwip, and the bullet pinged harmlessly off a vintage fire engine's steel bumper. I have the money. I have the papers. By sunrise, I'll be on a plane, and you'll be a headline in a cold case file. You're still talking about money, Victor, I said, my voice echoing off the brick walls from a position 20 feet to his left. I was moving through the mezzanine, my boots silent on the steel grating I'd oiled earlier. Money didn't save your father in that warehouse in Mutngin Chin Chum Chin Witam. It just provided the fuel. Don't you talk about my father, Vance screamed, firing 2 more shots toward the sound of my voice. The muzzle flashes were brief, strobing bursts of orange in the white void. I didn't flinch. I had spent my life in rooms where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I knew how to navigate by the heat of a man's breathing and the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. I adjusted the thermal imaging camera, the old FLIR unit I'd pulled from storage. Through the lens, the world was a palette of blues and greens, except for the bright, pulsing red-orange heat signature in the center of the floor. Vance was lit up like a flare. He taught you well, didn't he? I said, shifting to the right. He taught you that everything is a commodity, even family, especially family. He was going to burn that warehouse for the payout, but you realized the payout was bigger if he was inside, one less partner to split the legacy with. Vance stopped moving. He was standing near the old brass pole, his breath coming in ragged, visible plumes. He was weak, Elias. He was sloppy. He was going to get caught, and he was going to take me down with him. I just accelerated the inevitable. And Clara? Was she also inevitable? Clara was a tool. Vance spat, his voice dropping into a low, venomous growl. She was the perfect shield. Who suspects the son-in-law of a saint? But she started getting curious. She started looking at the ledgers. And then you served that notice. You forced my hand, old man. You're the reason they had to die. I felt the rage simmer in my gut, but I kept it cold. A hot fire is a fast fire, and a fast fire is a sloppy one. I needed him to keep talking. I reached into my pocket and hit the record button on the department radio I'd patched into the station's PA system. Every word he said was being transmitted directly to Silas Miller and the state patrol sergeant sitting in a cruiser 3 blocks away. The money is gone, Victor, I said. Julian Miller didn't just track the wires. He froze them. That offshore entity in the Grenadines? It's a front for a federal task force. You wired your entire legacy into a digital vault you'll never see again. Vance's heat signature wavered. He stumbled back, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. You're lying. You're a civil servant. You don't have that kind of reach. I don't, but the people you stole from do. You think Gator and his crew were the only ones looking for their investment? You've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for 10 years, Victor. And Paul just walked into the room with a badge. Vance let out a primal scream and began firing wildly, the bullets shredding the foam and shattering the glass of the old trophy case in the hallway. He was breaking. The sophisticated old money facade had completely dissolved, leaving behind the terrified, murderous teenager from the Hudson Valley. I'll kill you, he shrieked. I'll burn this whole city down before I let you take it from me. The city is already watching, Victor. I pulled the manual release on the bay doors. The massive steel curtains groaned and began to rise, the heavy chains rattling like a ghost's shackles. Cold, midnight air rushed into the station, swirling the foam into chaotic drifts. Vance squinted against the sudden influx of light from the street lamps. He saw the silhouettes of the police cruisers, the blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement like a neon funeral. He saw the wall of officers with their shields up, weapons drawn. But most importantly, he saw Clara. She was standing behind the front line, wrapped in a heavy department jacket. She wasn't crying anymore. She was holding a phone, her face illuminated by the screen. She had been listening to every word of his confession. She had heard him call her a tool. She had heard him admit to trying to kill her and her sons. Vance froze. The pistol dangled at his side. He looked at her, and for a second I saw a flicker of the old charm try to reassert itself. He straightened his tactical jacket, wiped a smear of foam from his face, and took a step toward the open bay. Clara, he called out, his voice suddenly soft, wounded. Honey, you have to listen to me. He's crazy. He's got some kind of gas in here. He's making me say things. He's been drugging me. Clara didn't move. She didn't speak. She just looked at him with a cold, absolute silence that was more devastating than any scream. I have the recording, Vance, she said. her voice amplified by the megaphone a deputy handed her. It echoed through the station, bouncing off the brick and the steel. I heard you. I heard what you did to your father. I heard what you think of me. It's over. There is no legacy. There's just the ash you're standing in. Vance's face contorted into something unrecognizable. The realization that he had lost not just the money, but the narrative, hit him like a structural collapse. He looked back into the darkness of the station, searching for me. You did this, he roared. You destroyed it all. He raised his gun, but he didn't aim at the police. He aimed it up at the mezzanine, toward the shadow where I stood. Elias Thorne, he screamed. If I'm going to hell, you're coming with me. He pulled the trigger, but there was only a metallic click. The chemical foam had gotten into the firing mechanism, or maybe the gun had jammed after his frantic spree. He frantically pulled the slide back, trying to clear the chamber, but it was too late. I stepped out onto the edge of the mezzanine, the light from the street finally hitting my face. I looked down at him, my bandaged hands resting on the rail. In my job, Victor, we have a term for a fire that burns itself out because it has nothing left to consume. I said, my voice steady and low. It's called a blackout. You're in a blackout, son, and there's no one left to call for help. Vance dropped the gun into the foam. He fell to his knees, his head in his hands, as the officers swarmed the bay. They didn't even have to use force. He was a hollow shell, a man who had been built out of smoke and mirrors, and the wind had finally changed. As they handcuffed him and led him out into the rain, Silas Miller walked up the stairs to the mezzanine. He stood beside me, looking down at the empty station floor. We got the confession on the wire, Elias, Silas said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Every word: arson, fraud, attempted murder, and the 1998 cold case in New York. He's never seeing the sun again. Is she okay? I asked, my eyes fixed on Clara, who was being ushered into an ambulance by a medic, not because she was hurt, but because she needed a place to sit. She's a thorn, Elias, Silas said with a small, weary smile. She's built for the heat, but you need to get to the hospital. Your hands look like raw meat, and I think you've got at least 3 broken ribs. I didn't feel the pain. Not yet. I just felt a strange, hollow relief. I had saved the house. I had saved the legacy. And most importantly, I had saved the boys. But as I watched the police tape being stretched across the entrance of the station, I realized that the hardest part was just beginning. I had spent my life as the hero who put out the fires. Now, I had to figure out how to live in a world that was still smoldering. I walked down the stairs, every step a struggle against the gravity of the night. When I reached the pavement, Clara was waiting for me. She didn't say anything. She just walked into my arms, burying her face in my soot-stained chest. We stood there for a long time in the rain, surrounded by the wreckage of a life that had been built on a lie. We have to go to the boys, Dad, she whispered. I know, I said, but first there's one more thing we have to do. What? I looked toward the black SUV that the police had towed back into the city. Vance didn't just steal the money, Clara. He stole your mother's wedding ring from the safe. He was going to sell it to a fence in Wilmington. I want it back. But as I looked at the trunk of the SUV, I saw something that the police had missed. A small, blue, LED light was blinking under the rear bumper. My blood went cold. I knew that light. It wasn't a tracker. It was a remote receiver for a secondary charge. Vance hadn't just planned to kill them on the bridge. He had a fail-safe. If he was caught, if he couldn't have the legacy, then no one could. The SUV was parked 10 feet from the ambulance, where Sam and Leo were sitting. Get back, I screamed, shoving Clara toward the ground. Silas, clear the ambulance. Get the boys out. Now. The night, which I thought had finally gone quiet, was about to find its second wind. And this time, I didn't have an axe or a hose. I only had a few seconds. I didn't think. You don't think when the roof is coming down, you move. I lunged for the driver's side door of the black SUV, my bandaged hands screaming as I gripped the handle. It was locked. I looked through the window and saw the keys sitting in the center console, the fob that Vance had tossed there when he was taken down. I didn't have time for a Slim Jim or a lockpick. I swung my elbow into the glass. The impact sent a sickening jolt through my fractured ribs, but the window shattered. I reached inside, ignoring the glass biting into my forearms, and grabbed the fob. I hit the start button, and the engine roared to life. In my peripheral vision, I saw Silas and the other officers lunging toward the ambulance, dragging Sam and Leo out of the back. They were confused, crying, but they were moving. I slammed the Suburban into gear and floored it. The blue LED was blinking faster now, a rapid, panicked heartbeat of light. I knew the technology. This was a proximity trigger tied to Vance's phone. Now that the police were moving him toward the transport van, the signal was stretching. Once he reached a certain distance, the connection would break, and the receiver would assume he'd been compromised. The failsafe would engage. I drove the heavy vehicle away from the station, away from the ambulances, and away from my daughter. I headed toward the vacant industrial lots behind 9th Street, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I saw the silhouette of the old fire station shrinking behind me. I saw Clara being held back by a state trooper, her arms reaching for me, her mouth open in a silent scream. I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted to be a grandfather. I reached the center of a gravel lot, a desolate space used for crushing concrete. I slammed the SUV into park and bailed out, rolling across the rough stones. I didn't stop. I kept running, my boots heavy, my breath a ragged wheeze in the cold night air. I reached the concrete pylon of an old loading dock and threw myself behind it. 3 seconds later, the world turned white. The explosion wasn't the massive fireball you see in the movies. It was a sharp, high-velocity crack followed by a localized eruptive force. Vance hadn't used enough C-bone to level a building. He'd used just enough to turn that SUV into a jagged cloud of shrapnel. The shockwave rolled over me, pressing me into the dirt, and the sound of falling metal rained down on the gravel for what felt like an eternity. Then, there was silence. Only the sound of the rain and the distant, frantic shouting from the station. I lay in the dirt for a long time, my face pressed against the cold earth. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the life we'd built, the quiet Sundays, and the way she used to tell me that I didn't always have to be the one to hold up the sky. Sometimes, Elias, she'd say, you have to let the rain fall. I finally pushed myself up. I was covered in soot, gravel, and blood. My turnouts were shredded, but as I looked back toward the station, I saw them. Silas was leading Clara and the boys toward the edge of the lot. They were running. Clara reached me first. She dropped to her knees in the mud, throwing her arms around my neck. She didn't say a word. She just held on, her body shaking with a relief so profound it felt like a prayer. Sam and Leo piled on a second later, their small hands clutching my jacket. "Grandpa," Sam whispered, his voice muffled by my shoulder. "You're all dirty." "Yeah, buddy," I croaked, my voice finally breaking. "I'm a bit of a mess." The aftermath was a blur of legal proceedings and medical evaluations. The story of Elias Thorne, the insane fire chief, didn't survive the night. The recording Vance had inadvertently made of his own confession, captured by the station's PA system and the department radio, was the final nail in the coffin of Victor Van Dorn Jr. The trial took place 6 months later. I sat in the front row, my hands scarred but functional, my ribs finally healed. Vance Victor sat at the defense table, his tailored suits replaced by orange jumpsuits. He looked smaller, diminished. Without the smoke and mirrors of his stolen legacy, he was just a pathetic, aging arsonist who had run out of fuel. The evidence Julian Miller had uncovered was staggering. The Van Dorn name wasn't just a shadow, it was a roadmap of 3 decades of systemic fraud. The FBI had joined the case, uncovering a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that spanned 4 continents. Vance wasn't just going to prison for attempted murder. He was being dismantled by the IRS, the SEC, and a half-dozen international agencies. But the final twist came on the last day of the trial. Julian called me into his office before the sentencing. He had a look on his face that I couldn't quite read, a mixture of awe and irony. "Elias," he said, handing me a single, yellow document. "We found the original Van Dorn Trust, the one Victor Sr. set up before the warehouse fire in Chinwitam." "I thought the money vanished," I said. "Most of it did. Victor Jr. spent years draining the liquid assets, but there was a clause, a bloodline contingency. Victor Sr. was a paranoid man. He didn't trust his son. He set up a secondary, irrevocable trust that would only trigger if Victor Jr. was ever convicted of a felony involving the estate." I looked at the document, and the trust assets didn't go to Victor Jr. They were slated to go to his legal heirs of the second generation. Since Victor was using a fake identity when he married Clara, the marriage was technically fraudulent, but the children, Sam and Leo, they are his legal biological heirs. The irony was a physical weight. Vance had spent his entire life trying to steal a legacy, murdering his own father and nearly destroying his own children to get it. And all the while, a fortune, a real one, built on the very bloodline he pretended to cherish, was waiting for the moment he failed. How much? I asked. After the back taxes and the penalties. Enough, Julian said with a small smile. Enough to ensure that Clara never has to worry about a mortgage again, and that Sam and Leo will never have to ask for a loan to see the world. It's about $4 million, Elias. It's held in a locked trust that Vance can never touch, even from prison. I walked out of the courthouse that day, into the bright, crisp air of a Charlotte autumn. Clara was waiting for me by the fountain, the boys playing with a golden retriever puppy we'd gotten them for Sam's birthday. She looked different, stronger, the shadows under her eyes finally gone. She was working again, teaching at the local elementary school, reclaiming the identity Vance had tried to erase. We didn't talk about the money, not then, we didn't need to. A few weeks later, we went back to the old cabin in the mountains, the one Vance had tried to sell out from under me. I had spent the summer restoring it, replacing the rotted deck boards and painting the shutters. It was a place of wood and stone, a place that understood the slow passage of time. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset dip below the blue ridge, when Leo wandered over and sat on the step next to me. He was holding a small, wooden fire truck I'd carved for him. "Grandpa," he said, looking up at me with those clear, honest eyes, "are you still a fireman?" I looked at my hands, the scars from the bridge, the marks of the foam, the history written in the skin. I thought about the notice of default. I thought about the fire in the basement and the whiteout in the station. "No, Leo," I said, ruffling his hair. "I'm retired." "But you saved us," he persisted. "That's what firemen do." "I didn't save you because I was a fireman, Leo," I said, looking out at the darkening forest. "I saved you because you're my family, and family isn't a business. It's not an investment. It's the thing you protect even when the building is already gone." Clara came out then, carrying 2 mugs of hot cider. She sat in the rocker next to mine, the creak of the wood a comforting, familiar rhythm. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the Carolina sky. Vance Sterling, Victor Van Dorn, was a ghost now, a name whispered in courtrooms and typed into legal briefs. He had wanted a legacy of gold and silk, a history written in the ledgers of banks. But as I looked at my daughter and my grandsons, I realized he'd never understood what a real legacy was. A legacy isn't what you leave to people, it's what you leave in them. I had lost my savings, my house had been scorched, and my reputation had been dragged through the mud. But as Sam's laughter echoed through the trees, playing a game of tag with the dog, I knew I was the wealthiest man in the state. I had my Saturdays, I had my Sundays, and I had a family that knew the difference between the light of a fire and the warmth of a home. The notice of default had been the end of a lie. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, with the smell of pine and the sound of the wind, I realized it was also the beginning of the truth. I took a sip of the cider, the warmth spreading through my chest. The world was quiet, the air was clear, and for the first time in a very long time, the fire was finally out.